Boccaccio's Decameron. Second day, fourth story. When she saw that Pampanea had brought her story to its triumphant close, Loretta, who was seated next to her, took up her cue without a pause and began to speak as follows. Fairest ladies, it is in my opinion impossible to envisage a more striking act of fortune than the spectacle of a person being raised from the depths of poverty to regal status, which is what happened, as we have been shown by Pampanea's story, in the case of her Alessandro, and which, from now on, nobody telling a story on the prescribed subject can possibly exceed those limits. I shall not blush to narrate a tale which, whilst it contains greater misfortunes, does not, however, possess so magnificent an ending. I realize, of course, what I think of the previous story, that my own will be followed less attentively. But since it is the best I can manage, I trust that I shall be forgiven. Few parts of Italy, if any, are reckoned to be more delightful than the sea coast between Reggio and Gaeta. In this region, not far from Salerno, there is a strip of land overlooking the sea, known to the inhabitants as the Amalfi Coast, which is dotted with small towns, gardens, and fountains, and swarming with as wealthy and enterprising a set of merchants as you will find anywhere. In one of these little towns, called Ravello, there once lived a certain Landolfo Rufolo. And although Ravello still has its quota of rich men, this Rufolo was a very rich man indeed. But being dissatisfied with his fortune, he sought to double it, and as a result, he nearly lost every penny he possessed, and his life too. This Rufolo, then, having made this sort of preliminary calculations that merchants normally make, purchased a very large ship, loaded it with a mixed cargo of goods paid for entirely out of his own pocket, and sailed with them to Cyprus. But on his arrival, he discovered that several other ships had docked there carrying precisely the same kinds of goods as those he had brought over himself. And for this reason, not only did he have to sell his cargo at a bargain price, but in order to complete his business, he was practically forced to give the stuff away, thus being brought to the verge of ruin. There's a classic example of supply and demand, isn't there? Being extremely distressed about all this, not knowing what to do, and finding himself reduced overnight from great wealth to semi-poverty, he decided he would make good his losses by privateering, which is piracy, or die in the attempt. At all events, having set out a rich man, he was determined not to return home in poverty, and so, having found a buyer for his merchantman, he combined the proceeds with the money he had raised on his cargo and purchased a light pirate vessel, which he armed and fitted out, choosing only the equipment suited for the ship's purpose. He then applied himself to the systematic looting of other people's property, especially that of the Turks. In his new role, he met with far more success than he had encountered in his trading activities. Within the space of about a year, he raided and seized so many Turkish ships that, quite apart from having regained what he had lost in trading, he discovered that he was considerably more than twice as wealthy as before. He thus had enough, he now realized, to avoid the risk of repeating his former mistake. And once he had persuaded himself to rest content with what he had, he made up his mind to call it a day and returned home with the loot. Being wary of commercial ventures, he did not bother to invest his money, but simply steered a homeward course at breakneck speed in the tiny ship with which he had collected his spoils. He had come as far as the archipelago, this would be Greece, when he found himself sailing one evening directly into the teeth of a southerly gale, and his frail craft was barely able to cope with the mountainous seas. So he put into a cove on the leeward side of a small island, with the intention of waiting for more favorable winds. He had not been there long, however, when two large Genoese carracks, these are very large, heavily armed ships, cargo ships, but heavily armed to keep pirates away, homeward bound from Constantinople, struggled into the bay to escape the same storm which Landolfo had taken shelter. The crews of the Genoese ship recognized Landolfo's vessel, which they already knew from various rumors to be loaded with booty, and being by nature a rapacious and money-grubbing set of people, they blocked his way of escape and made their preparation for seizing the prize. First, they put ashore a large party of well-armed men with crossbows who were strategically placed so that no one was able to leave Landolfo's vessel without running into a barrage of arrows. Then they launched cutters, by means of which, aided by the current, they drew themselves towards Landolfo's little ship. This they captured without losing a man. After a brief and half-hearted struggle, they took her crew prisoner. Landolfo was left wearing nothing but a threadbare double doublet, and taken aboard one of their ships. And after everything of value had been removed from the vessel, they sent it to the bottom. The next day, the wind changed quarter, and the two ships hoisted their sails and set a westerly course. For the whole of the day they made good progress, but in the evening a gale began to blow, producing very heavy seas and separating the two carracks from each other. By a stroke of ill luck, the ship in which the wretched, destitute Landolfo was traveling was driven by force of gale on to the coast of the island of Cephalonia, where she ran aground with a tremendous crash, split wide open, and like a piece of glass being flung against a wall, smashed to smithereens. As is usually the case when this happens, the sea was rapidly littered with an assortment of floating planks, chests, and merchandise, and although it was pitch dark and there was a heavy swell, the poor wretches who had survived the wreck, or those of them who could swim, began to cling to whatever object happened to float across their path. One of their number was poor Landolfo, who had in fact been calling out all day for death to come and take him, for he felt he would rather die than return home poverty-stricken. But now that he was staring death in the face, he was frightened by the prospect, and like the others, he too clung to the first spar that came within his reach, in the hope that he might remain afloat a little longer. God might somehow come to his rescue. Settling himself astride the spar as best he could, he clung on till daybreak, meanwhile being tossed hither and thither by the sea and wind. When dawn came, he cast his eyes around him, but all he could see was clouds and water, and a chest floating on the sea's surface. To his great consternation, this chest floated every so often into his vicinity, causing him to fear lest it should collide into him and do him injury. So whenever it came too near, he summoned up the meager strength he still possessed and pushed it away as best as he could with both his hands. But as luck would have it, the sea was struck by a sudden squall, which sent the chest hurtling into Landolfo's spar, upending it, and inevitably caused Landolfo to lose his grip and go under. When he resurfaced, he found that he was some distance away from the spar, and he was afraid that he would never reach it, for he was exhausted, and only his panic was keeping him afloat. He therefore made for the chest, which was quite close at hand, and dragging himself up on its lid, he sprawled across it and held it steady with his arms, and in this fashion buffeted this way and that by the sea, with nothing to eat and far more to drink than he would have wished. Not knowing where he was, and seeing nothing but water, he survived for the whole of that day and the following night. By the next day, Landolfo had almost turned into a sponge, when either through the will of God or the power of the wind, he arrived off the coast of the island of Corfu. Clinging grimly to the edges of the chest with both hands, just as we see a man in danger of drowning attaching himself firmly to anything within reach. He was sighted by a peasant woman who happened to be scouring and polishing her pots and pans in the sand and salt water. At first, being unable to make out what creature it was that was approaching the shore, she started back with a cry of alarm. He said nothing to her, for he was quite unable to speak and scarcely able to see. But as the current bore him closer to the shore, she could make out the shape of the chest, and peering more intently, she first of all recognized a pair of arms stretched across its lid, after which she picked out the face and realized it was a human being. Prompted by compassion, she waded some distance out into the sea, which was now quite calm, took him by the hair and dragged him to the shore, chest and all. There, with an effort, she unhooked his hands from the chest, which she placed on the head of her young daughter, who was with her, while she herself carried Landolfo away like a baby and put him into a hot bath. She rubbed away so vigorously at him and poured so much hot water over him that eventually he began to thaw out and recover some of his lost strength. And when she judged it to be the right moment, she took him from the bath and refreshed him with a quantity of good wine and nourishing food. After she had nursed him to the best of her ability for several days, his recovery was complete, and he took stock of his surroundings. The good woman therefore decided it was time to hand over his chest, which she had been keeping for him, and tell him that from now on he must fend for himself, and this she did. He could remember nothing about any chest, but he nevertheless accepted it when the good woman offered it to him, for he thought it could hardly be so valueless that it would not keep him going for a few days. His hopes were severely jolted when he discovered how light it was. But all the same, when the woman was out of the house, he forced it open to see what was inside and discovered that it contained a number of precious stones, some of them loose and others mounted. Being quite knowledgeable on the subject of jewels, he realized from the moment he saw them that they were extremely valuable, and his spirits rose higher than ever. He praised God for once again coming to his rescue. But since fortune had dealt him 2 cruel blows in rapid succession, and might conceivably deal him a third, he decided he would have to proceed with great caution if he wanted to convey these things safely home. So he wrapped them up as careful as he could in some old rags, told the woman that if she liked, she could keep the chest, since he no longer had any use for it, and asked her to let him have a sack in exchange. The good woman gladly complied with his request after he had thanked her profusely for the assistance she had rendered. He slung his sack over his shoulder and went on his way, first taking a boat to Brindisi, and then making his way gradually up the coast as far as Trani, where he met some cloth merchants who hailed from his native town. Without mentioning the chest, he gave them an account of all his adventure, and they felt so sorry for him that they fitted him out with new clothes, lent him a horse, and sent him back with company to Ravello, whither he was intent on returning at all costs. Secure at last in Ravello, he gave thanks to God for leading him safely home, untied his little sack, and made what was virtually his first real inspection of its contents. The stones he possessed were, he discovered, so valuable and numerous that even if he sold them at less than their market value, he would be twice as rich as he had been when he set out. So that, having taken steps to dispose of his gems, he sent by way of payment for services received a tidy sum of money to the good woman of Corfu, who had fished him out of the sea, and likewise he sent a further sum to the people of Trani, who had given him the new clothes. He was no longer interested in commerce, so he kept the remainder of the money and lived in splendor for the rest of his days. Well, that's a nice story. This is actually kind of unusual for Boccaccio's stories, because this one is almost true. Boccaccio did spend time on the Amalfi Coast. His descriptions of it, it is gorgeous. He is not leading you astray. And there was, rather than Landolfo Rufolo, there was a Lorenzo Rufolo at one point who had lost his money and turned to piracy, but did not come to quite as happy an ending. He died in prison in 1291. Although it's quite likely that Boccaccio, visiting Ravenna, visiting the Amalfi Coast at that time as a young man, would have met people who had remembered Lorenzo Rufolo. But yeah, it's almost a true story based on almost real events, but not with a happy ending. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the story, and that's that. Bye-bye. Figure out if I can stop this thing.